Floating charge is the debt owed by a person debtor to another creditor may be either unsecured or secured. If the debtor defaults, the creditor can sue for the amount owed. If the debtor becomes insolvent or disappears, creditor has no security. A wise creditor, therefore, will demand security, or in other words, a right over the debtor's property which is in addition to his right of action. The power of a company to borrow includes the power to create a charge upon its asset. The charge that may be created on the assets of a company may be fixed charge or floating charge. The charges created by a company may be classified as a fixed charge or floating charge. A fixed charge is a charge which attaches to a specific asset owned by the company. It is created on properties such as land and building, plant and machinery whose identity does not change during the period of loan. As the fixed charge is attached to the assets, the company cannot deal with the assets unless with the prior consent of the lender. If the company were to do so without the lender's prior consent, the assets continue to be subject to the charge until they are released by the lender. The company creates a floating charge over its asset. The assets can be specific or a class of assets. A floating charge is an equitable charge which is created on some class of property which is constantly changing. For example, charge on stock in trade, trade debtors, and many more. The company can deal in such property in the normal course of business until the charge becomes fixed on the happening of an event. The main idea behind a floating charge is allow to the company to carry on its business in the ordinary course as if no charge had been created. Debentures usually creates a floating charge of the asset of a company. As the charge floats over the assets and does not attach to the assets, the company may continue to deal with the charged assets in its ordinary course of business to maintain itself as going concern. This includes the right to sell and to charge the assets as securities for loans. Furthermore, if the charge is over a class of assets, it will also float over assets of that class which are subsequently acquired by the company. In summary, the characteristics of floating charge are as follows. The first one is a charge usually over a class of assets present and future. The second one is the asset may change from time to time in the company's ordinary course of business. The third one, until the charge crystallizes, the company can deal with the assets in the ordinary course of its business. And last but not least, on occurrence of certain events, the charge will attach and becomes fixed.
When does a floating charge become crystallized? A floating charge becomes crystallized when a company takes out loan and secure it with their inventory. Although the inventory is collateral on the loan, the borrower can still sell and deal with it as usual. As the borrower sells, restocks, and changes its inventory, it shifts or floats in value. However, if the borrower fails to do the repayment, the floating charge security will become crystallized and turn into a fixed charge security. Crystallization also occurs if the company ends its operations or if the borrower and the lender go to court and the court appoints a receiver. Once crystallized, the asset cannot be sold and the lender may take possession of it. Essentially, upon crystallization, the asset underlying security can no longer float in value. It must crystallize to reduce the risk for the lender.
Created using Powtoon.
In Section 352, Subsection 1, subject to this division where a charge to which this section applies is created by a company, they shall be lodged with the registrar for registration within 30 days after the creation of the charge, a statement of the prescribed particulars. If this section is not complied with in relation to the charge shall be conferred but void against the liquidator and any creditors of the company. Nothing is subsection 1 shall prejudice any contract or obligation for repayment of the payment secured by a charge. When a charge becomes void under this section, the money secured thereby shall immediately become payable. Contravention of this subsection, the company and every officer are liable to be fined not exceeding 50,000 ringgit. There are two types for this floating charge, which is Section 353 and Section 357. For the Section 353, you have to list the types of charges that requires registration. And for the Section 357, you have to set out the particulars of a charge kept in registrar by the registrar inter alia. You have to follow this following, which is date of creation, date of acquisition of property if the charge is existing on property acquired by company, the amount secured by the charge, description sufficient to identify the property charge, and name of person entitled to the charge. Next is factors for priority charge. There are 4 factors for the priority charge, which is number 1, whether the charge was registered. Number 2, whether the charge is fixed or floating. Number 3 is floating charge, whether there has been crystallization. And number 4, whether there are any preferential creditors. Priorities of registrable charges. 2 fixed charges on the same property. The fixed charge, which is created early, is in priority to the fixed charge, which is created later. This is so provided both the fixed charges are registered. This means that the first in creation prevails. 2 floating charges on the same property. The floating charge, which is created earlier, is in priority to the floating charge, which is created later. This is so provided both the floating charges are registered. This means that the first in creation prevails. If there are 2 charges on the same property, if they are both not registered, then the charge which is created first is in priority since it has been created first. If there is a fixed charge and a floating charge on the same property, the fixed charge is in the priority. This is because when a fixed charge is created, the company has no right to deal with the assets, which are subject to the change. This is to be compressed with the floating charge, whereby a company can still deal with the assets which are subject to the floating charge. Floating charge is supported by a negative pledge clause. The negative pledge clause means that the company has given a promise to the creditor who has a floating charge that it will not create a subsequent charge to be in priority to the floating charge.
Reynolds Brothers Motors vs Sanda. Reynolds had been engaged in the business of selling agricultural equipment. He entered into an agreement with Esanda, which is provided that Reynolds had possession of certain tractors as bailey for Esanda. He enables to sell the tractors as Esanda's agent and earn commissions. He also owned a number of its own tractors. He granted all the state of Bank of New South Wales a floating charge over all its assets in 1981. Reynolds breached its agreement with Esanda when it sold Esanda's tractors and failed to give the outcomes to Esanda. He transferred off his own 10 tractors to Esanda as it to reduce his debt. The State Bank treated this as a breach of the terms of its floating charge and gave the dealer notice that the floating charge had crystallized and appointed a receiver and a manager. The court held that the transfer of the tractors to Esanda had been a valid sale by the dealer to the plaintiff, for the reason that when the transaction occurred, the dealer's undertaking was still a going concern. And it was done by the Renault in the ordinary course of business. That transaction did not crystallize the charge, meant that the tractors were not covered by the State Bank's floating charge.
Created using Powtoon.